It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new house, a new life. My husband, Mark, and I had been looking for a place to settle for months. After all the moving from one place to another, from one apartment to another, we thought it was finally time to settle down, to give our son, Lucas, some stability. So, when we found the house, a large, old Victorian-style home nestled on the outskirts of town, we thought our dreams had come true. The house was perfect. It had the kind of charm that people only talk about in fairy tales. But I didn't know then that those fairy tales sometimes have a darker side, one that stays with you long after the last page is turned. From the moment we moved in, there was something off. It wasn't obvious at first. The creaky floors, the ancient wallpaper, and the musty smell that lingered in the corners seemed like normal quirks of an old house. Mark was already busy with work, so it fell to me to unpack the boxes and make the house a home for our little family. But as the days passed, I started noticing things I couldn't explain. At night, I would hear faint whispers, almost like a child's laughter, drifting through the house. I would tell myself it was the wind, or the house settling, or even just my imagination, but deep down, I felt that something wasn't right. It was Lucas who first noticed it. He was just 5 years old at the time, a curious, bright boy with an endless sense of wonder. He had always been the type to make friends quickly, so when I saw him talking to himself one afternoon in the living room, I thought nothing of it. He'd made up imaginary friends before, but when I asked him who he was talking to, he simply smiled and said, "My friend, Sam." I didn't think much of it. Imaginary friends were common at Lucas's age, and he had never been particularly scared of anything. But that changed the night Mark and I were sitting in the living room, discussing the plans for the upcoming weekend. We had just gotten comfortable when Lucas suddenly appeared at the doorway, his small face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom," he whispered, "Sam told me not to go upstairs." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the kind of unease that I couldn't shake. Mark, sensing my discomfort, quickly reassured Lucas. "It's okay, buddy. Sam is just a friend. Nothing to be scared of." But Lucas didn't look reassured. He seemed frozen, staring at the stairs as if something or someone was watching him. I walked over to him, knelt down, and asked him what Sam had said. He told me that the house is lonely," Lucas said softly, his voice trembling. "He says we shouldn't be here." I smiled, brushing it off as childish nonsense, but the air in the room felt thicker, heavier. A sense of foreboding lingered, like something was waiting just out of sight. Later that night, after we tucked Lucas into bed, I heard him talking again. His voice was soft, like he was trying to be quiet, but I could still make out the words. Sam. Sam this, Sam that. It was as if he was having a conversation with someone invisible, someone only he could see. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look at the house. I had always been drawn to its old-world charm, but now I began to wonder if there was something more to it than met the eye. I started poking around the attic, the basement, places we hadn't fully explored yet. That's when I found the first clue. It was a small, faded photograph, wedged between the cracks of the attic floorboards. It was a picture of a little boy, his face pale and sad. I had no idea who he was, but something about the photo made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like the boy was watching me, his eyes following my every movement. I tucked the photo into my pocket, intending to ask Mark about it later, but when I descended the stairs, Lucas was waiting for me. He stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up at me with a strange expression on his face. "Mom, Sam says you found his picture," Lucas said in a whisper, his voice barely audible. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He says it's his picture," Lucas replied, his eyes wide with fear. "He wants you to put it back where you found it." I didn't understand. Who was this boy, Sam? And why was he talking to Lucas? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. Lucas would leave small toys in odd places around the house, each one arranged in a perfect circle. He'd whisper to Sam in the dark, his voice so soft that I couldn't make out the words. I began to feel like I was losing control of everything. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. The house was silent except for the faint creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I got up to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached Lucas's room, I found the door slightly ajar, and the light from the hallway flickered eerily in the darkness. I pushed the door open, only to find that Lucas was sitting on the floor, staring at the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, his body stiff with fear. "Lucas," I whispered, but he didn't respond. I walked over to him, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. He flinched, his body jerking as though he had been pulled from a trance. He slowly turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn. "Mom," he whispered, "Sam's not happy. He says I can't leave, or I'll never see you again." My heart dropped. What was happening to my son? Who was this Sam, and what did he want with us? I didn't know it then, but the answers I was searching for would soon lead me down a path darker than I could ever imagine. The house seemed to have a life of its own. Each day, more strange things began to happen. Mark was getting frustrated with my constant worries, chalking it up to stress from the move. But deep inside, I knew something was wrong, something darker than I was willing to admit. It was early one morning when the situation took a drastic turn. I woke up to the sound of Lucas calling my name. At first, I thought it was just another dream or a bad night's sleep, but then I heard it again, his voice, muffled through the walls. I rushed to his room, only to find it empty. His bed was unmade, the covers thrown aside as if he'd been pulled out of it suddenly. I felt a cold sweat break out across my back as I scanned the room. "Lucas?" I called, panic seeping into my voice. It was only then that I noticed the door to the attic, which had always been locked, was slightly ajar. I had never allowed Lucas to go up there. The attic was one of the few places in the house that felt utterly forbidden to me, and yet the door was open, and something told me that Lucas was up there. I climbed the narrow staircase, my heart racing. The air up there was thick and musty, filled with dust and the remnants of old furniture. I could barely see anything, but then I heard it, the faint sound of a child's laughter, soft and echoing. I stepped into the attic, my breath catching in my throat as I saw Lucas standing in the far corner of the room, talking to someone. I froze. Lucas's back was to me, but he was speaking clearly, his words oddly adult. "Sam, I don't want to anymore. Please, I'm sorry. I can't play with you anymore." I took a cautious step forward, my voice trembling. "Lucas?" He turned to face me, his eyes wide but empty, as though he wasn't fully present. "Mom, Sam's upset," he whispered. "He's not happy with me." The room seemed to grow colder, the air pressing in on me from all sides, I could feel a presence, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. Before I could say anything else, Lucas turned away from me again, his small frame walking toward the farthest corner of the attic. But as he did, I caught sight of something chilling. A name scrawled across the wall in what appeared to be red paint? Or was it something else? Sam, the name was written, but it was crooked, almost as if someone had been trembling when they wrote it. I rushed to Lucas, pulling him into my arms. No more, Lucas. We're not playing with Sam anymore. Do you understand? But Lucas didn't respond. His body went limp in my arms, his face pale, as if drained of all energy. I carried him downstairs, shaking, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this Sam? And why was he so determined to keep Lucas in the attic? Mark came home shortly afterward, and I told him everything. He seemed less concerned, brushing it off as a child's imagination and fear of the unknown. But there was something in his eyes that I didn't trust. Something told me he was hiding something from me. That night, the house seemed to echo with the sounds of whispers again. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of a child's voice, calling out from the attic. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what was happening to my family. I called the local historical society, hoping to find some answers. The woman on the other end seemed cautious when I mentioned the house's history. After a brief pause, she finally told me something that sent chills down my spine. The house you've moved into was once home to a young boy who went missing many years ago. His name was Samuel Jackson. He was the last child in the neighborhood to disappear, and no one ever found out what happened to him. His family eventually moved away, and the house was left abandoned for years. It's believed that Samuel's spirit never left the property. I froze. Samuel. Sam? The pieces were falling into place, but I still didn't understand. Why was Lucas so connected to this boy, and why was he being drawn into something so dark? I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but the evidence was clear. Lucas was being targeted by a spirit that wanted something from him. But what? Why had this boy's spirit lingered for so long? The next few days were a blur of confusion, fear, and sleepless nights. Lucas's behavior continued to change. He would have long conversations with someone no one else could see. He started drawing pictures of a boy with hollow eyes and a sad smile, and sometimes, when I would check on him at night, I would catch him standing at the window, staring into the dark as though waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. But the worst came when I found the old photograph. I had been going through boxes in the attic, trying to find anything that might help me understand what was happening, when I stumbled upon a photo album. I flipped through the pages until one image caught my eye. It was a picture of a little boy. His face was pale, his hair dark and matted. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck me. It was his eyes. They were empty, hollow, staring into the camera with an intensity that made me shiver. This was Samuel. This was Sam. I rushed downstairs, clutching the photo. "Mark, you need to see this," I called out. He took the photo from my hands, his face growing pale as he looked at it. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice strained. "It's from the attic. Mark, this is the boy. This is Sam. This is the boy Lucas has been talking to." Mark looked at the photo again, and I could see something flicker in his eyes, something dark. "I never told you about him," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "I never told you about the history of this house." I didn't understand. What history? What had he been hiding from me? And then, just as everything seemed to come together, something happened that changed everything. The whispers in the house grew louder, more frantic. I could feel them pressing in on me, crawling under my skin. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and in the dead of night, I heard a voice, Samuel's voice, whispering in my ear. "I'm coming for him," the voice said, sending a chill down my spine. And then, the floorboards creaked. I spun around, only to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide in terror. I don't want to play anymore, Mommy," he whispered, trembling. The house felt alive. The walls seemed to breathe, their old wooden panels groaning with each passing second. The air was dense and suffocating, as though it was pressing in on us, pushing us toward an inevitable confrontation. Lucas was quiet, too quiet. He clung to me as if I were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world, but his eyes betrayed a distance, a pull toward something I couldn't see. Mark, on the other hand, had grown more withdrawn. He spent hours staring at that photo of Samuel, his hands trembling as though holding it hurt him. It was clear he knew more than he was letting on, and I was done waiting for answers. "Mark," I demanded one night as we sat in the dimly lit living room. Lucas was asleep upstairs, or so I hoped, and the oppressive silence of the house loomed over us. "You need to tell me what's going on. What aren't you telling me about this house? About Sam?" He rubbed his temples, his face pale and hollow. Finally, he looked at me, his voice low and strained. "I didn't want to believe it," he began. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away." "Ignore what?" I snapped. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated before continuing. "When I was a kid, I lived in this neighborhood. Not this house, but a few streets over. Everyone knew about the Jackson family and their son, Sam. He was strange. Quiet, reserved. He didn't have many friends, and there were always rumors about him. People said he would talk to himself, spend hours in the woods behind the house, whispering to someone no one else could see. And then, one day, he disappeared. Just vanished. They never found his body, but people said his spirit never left this house. The weight of his words sank in like a stone in my chest. "You knew this, and you still moved us here?" I hissed, my voice shaking with anger. Mark's face crumpled. "I didn't think it was real. I thought it was just old stories. But now—" He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Now I know it's not just a story." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted from the couch, Mark close behind me. We raced up the stairs, the hallway stretching out before us like a dark tunnel. Lucas's room was at the end, the door slightly ajar. "Lucas!" I called, panic rising in my voice. Pushing the door open, I froze. The room was empty. His bed was overturned, his toys scattered across the floor. But what caught my attention was the writing on the walls. The name Sam was scrawled over and over again, in crayon, marker, and what looked disturbingly like blood. And then I heard it, a soft, echoing laugh coming from the attic. Mark and I exchanged a terrified glance before we ran to the attic door. It was wide open, the staircase leading up into darkness. The air was freezing, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave this house and never look back. But Lucas was up there, and I wasn't leaving without him. The attic was darker than I remembered, the single bulb overhead flickering weakly. In the corner of the room stood Lucas. His back was to us, and he was staring at the far wall where the old mirror stood. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment I swore I saw something moving within it. "Lucas," I whispered, stepping closer. "Honey, come to me." But he didn't move. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed at the mirror. "He's here," he said softly. The air in the attic grew heavier, and the temperature plummeted. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to get him out of here," he said, his voice shaking. Before we could move, the mirror began to glow faintly, a pale blue light emanating from its surface. And then a figure emerged. It was a boy, no older than 8, with hollow eyes and a sad smile. His face was pale, almost translucent, and he stared at us with a mix of longing and malice. "Why did you leave me?" the boy whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. Mark stepped back, his face ashen. "Sam," he breathed. The boy turned his gaze to Lucas, his expression softening. "I'm not mad at you, Lucas. I just want to play. Stay with me, and we can play forever." "No!" I shouted, pulling Lucas away from the mirror. But the boy's face twisted into something monstrous, his eyes darkening as he let out an ear-piercing scream. The mirror shattered, the pieces flying across the attic like shards of ice. The force knocked us back, and I shielded Lucas with my body as the cold wind swirled around us. When the chaos subsided, the mirror was gone, and so was Sam. But the room still felt wrong, as though the darkness hadn't truly left. We didn't sleep that night. Mark and I sat in the living room, Lucas between us, as we tried to process what had happened. It was clear that the house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and we couldn't stay. The next morning, we packed our things and left, abandoning the house and everything in it. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and Lucas still talked about Sam in his sleep. Weeks later, I received a call from the new owners of the house. They had found something in the attic, a photo album filled with pictures of children. One of the pictures was of Lucas. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the soft sound of laughter, and I wonder if Sam ever truly let us go.